if you have to run away from a scary belief, you're not going to make it in the real world. Sorry. You got to be able to confront and dominate discursively without hiding behind censorship. If you can't do that, how the fuck? It's like if you can't debate some Nazi LARPer on Telegram, how the fuck are you going to talk to some, like, you know, conservative truck driver, which is actually harder to do than, because that guy is probably some, like, LARPer intellectual. It's pretty easy to establish dominance, but it's actually hard to communicate your ideas to a conservative trucker in a way that they're going to get on board with and they're going to understand. So people need to start learning how to not lose their shit and get their panties in a bunch when they're talking to opposing ideologies and debating them, okay? We care about meat and potatoes. Like, you ask me, what is Nazism? Nazis are when, in practice, it's not a LARP, it's actually a real thing, where you have the terrorist rule of finance capital, which is engaging in the systemic effort to exterminate and engage in genocide against people. I mean, that's a real thing. It's not some LARPer on the fucking internet who's obsessed with, you know, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. You don't think Bolsheviks had to, you know, talk to people who had those views? They did. Those kinds of views, they did, right? Anyway, enough ranting on that. In terms of ideology, infrared's a pretty diverse place. The infrared IgG community has got a whole range of diverse, but the thing holding it together is just Marxism, Leninism. Like, that's the standard official ideology. Then there's a bunch of other people who come here with other ideologies. And the reason all these other ideologies are being tolerated is because we apply Deng Xiaoping theory to political ideologies, which means we believe in a market competition of ideology under the guidance of one central ideology, one central party. So the infrared showrunners, we are the central party, the Marxist-Leninist vanguard, whatever, right? Whatever internet Americans say about politics. The vanguard party is stupid, right? I mean, it's like, that's not what Marxism-Leninism is actually about. Okay, that's what anarchists say. A stupid American leftist squabble, right? Anyway, it's not important. We are the ruling Communist Party dictatorship, and we tolerate the market, the free market of ideas, just like how Deng Xiaoping tolerated markets in actual economics, because we're doing Deng Xiaoping theory applied to internet communities and clout. It's clout-based Dengism. I crack myself up. But it's also kind of true. It's also pretty much true, right? We don't get our panties in a bunch and create intellectual red lines saying, oh, if you don't agree with me on this, we don't give a fuck about that, right? We're not trying to LARP the Cultural Revolution in China, which was something that happened in the past and it will never happen again, period, right? I want to communicate something very specific right now, because it's pretty tough. You think might think I'm rambling here, but it begs the question: what is Marxism-Leninism then? Is it a set of principles? Is it a red line you draw and you say you're in or you're out? Are you with my ideology community or are you not? Well, I've called Marxism-Leninism an ideology before, but I've also called it the ideology which is not an ideology. Because, believe it or not, Marxism-Leninism goes deeper than ideology. And I think the infrared community epitomizes that in the best kind of way. Your superficial beliefs are not where Marxism-Leninism is. Marxism-Leninism is not something that exists at the level of an individual's personal opinions or superficial beliefs. Marxism-Leninism is rooted in a concrete index of practice, which is historical. So when I say I'm a Marxist-Leninist, what I'm actually talking about is that I believe I have united the theory with an understanding of the historical practice that has actually existed across history. That's all it really means. Marxism-Leninism doesn't mean, for example, this is my specific ideology as opposed to this other ideology. All Marxism-Leninism is a specific historical tradition that marks it's an index of praxis, of of concrete experiences and achievements across the world. And most importantly, it's a specific way of relating to your own concrete circumstances and conditions. Hence the eccentricity of infrared when it comes to MAGA communism and the patriotic socialism. Straw man, because we never call ourselves that. But you get the idea. We are just Marxist-Leninists. This is just what Marxism-Leninism is. Marxism-Leninism is not a specific ideology. It's not a specific idea. All it is a unity of thought and practice. It's a unity of science and political practice. That's actually what Marxism-Leninism is. It's not some arbitrary belief that we want society to be this or that way. It's a specific science that unites the theoretical science with political application in practice. Now, why Marxism-Leninism entails very specifically communism is because it's simple. Science knows no metaphysical distinctions in reality. So we don't draw any distinctions as far as qualitative distinctions between human beings that we can eternalize and say this is forever. Even when it comes to nationalism, why are we not nationalists? Is it because we don't think nations are real? No, they're very real. It's just that you can't ontologize them and say this is something that exists for all time, this specific nation, because nations change across history. They just change at a scale that belongs as a national in logic. So the reason we're different from leftists and liberals in America is because although we don't believe nations, like a specific nation, is eternal, we also don't believe that that makes it unreal suddenly. Nations change, but they change according to their own logic. So Marxism-Leninism is a science. It's a specific kind of science, right? That's why Marxism-Leninism is not nationalistic. It's not metaphysical in any kind of way. Now, is it nation-oriented? Of course it is. It's more nation-oriented than nationalism, I would argue, by the way, because oftentimes I think nationalism is basically trying to create it's a form of metaphysics, basically, right? Nationalism is more concerned with the idea of one's nation than the actual nation, the real nation, right? I think historically, Marxists, Leninists, and communists were more nationalists than nationalists themselves in practice, right? It's just that in theory, it can be a hurdle to actually having a concrete and scientific assessment of the circumstances before you, right? Now, I'm using the word science. What do I mean by that? Do I mean the Fauci? No, I mean science just in the sense of a system of knowledge. It's actually pretty simple. You're sitting there as a libertarian, as a conservative, as a MAGA person, as a dissident of any kind, as a as a anything, even as a right-winger, right? You're there as a dissident. You're sitting here as a dissident. You're fighting against the woke agenda. You're trying to resist the elite agenda in every kind of way. And I have news for you. I have news for you. Your opposition to the status quo is the same opposition to the status quo that every other partisan and every other dissident in America has in content. It's the same thing. You oppose the status quo. If you oppose the status quo, that means there's some kind of problem in the status quo. There's some kind of problem in society, and there's some kind of problem in the state of the world in general. Now, all Marxism-Leninism does is intervene here and say, what is the nature of that problem? What is that problem specifically from a scientific rather than metaphysical perspective? And that's rooted in the idea of class struggle, for example. The problem at the heart of society is the social antagonism, the class struggle. But all Marxism-Leninism is here saying is, we want to create a science for revolutionaries. So you can belong to whatever fucking ideology you want, libertarian, conservative, even right-wing, it doesn't matter. But as long as you actually stand opposed to the state machine, as long as you actually stand opposed to the status quo, as long as you actually stand opposed to the ruling class and the ruling state of affairs, congratulations, you are in the same boat as every other revolutionary in history. And Marxism-Leninism is intervening here and saying there's a method to this. There's a science to this. There's an ability to understand what it exactly is that stands before you and how exactly one navigates politically to respond to it. How do we form a revolutionary party? How do we have a revolutionary strategy? How do we participate in the revolutionary overthrow of the status quo? It's happening right before our eyes, by the way. How do we respond to the contradictions of liberalism? And what are those contradictions? What is dialectical materialism? And how does this allow us to have a higher understanding of reality than otherwise? So there you go. So Erie Berry is making comments in my chat. Erie, will you come on stream and forward a position? Will you come on stream and actually argue something and make an argument? Will you even make an argument in my chat, right? You can even do it in my fucking chat since you're too much of a fucking pussy to come in VC. Go ahead and type in my chat and explain exactly what is so irrational about what I'm saying that it has to be attributed to some kind of fucking conspiracy? We want to create... No, I don't have to create a science for revolutionaries, you dumb fuck. Because that's already what Marxism, Leninism is. Dumbass. It's already that. What is dialectical materialism in layman's terms? Good question. It's actually an excellent question. Dialectical materialism views the world, views being, views existence as a unity of opposites. And what dialectical materialism allows us to perceive is how these opposites reconcile in specific ways. And those specific ways we call material. We call that the deeper texture, the deeper material reality below the surface. So what lies below the surface of apparent contradictions are specific material reconciliations of the opposites. So that sounds not very much in layman's terms, but it'll make sense when I give you an example. So, for example, you can have the contradiction between liberals and conservatives in America, or woke people and conservatives in America, right? Now, that's the contradiction that's on the surface. How, in actuality, is that contradiction part of one material reality? Well, you go below the surface and you see how that contradiction actually is reconciled by the class antagonism, right? Class difference. Another example of this is probably not a great example because below that contradiction is another contradiction. You can have the contradiction between, the apparent contradiction between the Republicans, and this is a beautiful one actually, probably. The Republicans and Democrats, it's an apparent superficial contradiction. So what would a dialectical materialist analysis be? Well, you'd go below the surface of that surface contradiction, and then how are those opposites reconciled? Well, they're reconciled in the material interests of the ruling class. So here you have a real concrete material interest of the ruling class that is reconciling this apparent contradiction on the surface. So dialectical materialism allows us to try and search for the material basis of contradictions that stand before our perceptions and our sensibilities in relation to the world, right? So that's a good example of it. So it's the unity of opposites, and ultimately the real unity of opposites is between the surface and the underlying reality, right? Or appearance and essence, the material and the idea, right? So that's what dialectical materialism more or less is about. And that science has allowed great historical civilizations like Russian and Chinese to survive the modern era and industrialize themselves outside of the hegemony of the international ruling class headquartered in the city of London and Wall Street. So you have this global ruling class, this international elite, this international capitalist elite that was pretty much controlling the world through colonies and through finance, banking, whatever, headquartered in the city of London, a handful of European nations, the royal families of Europe, all related to each other after the Napoleonic Wars directly, by the way. So they're controlling the world, right? And how do you actually modernize your country and industrialize your country outside of the hegemony of their rule and their dictatorship? Well, that's what Marxism, Leninism allowed them to do.